WoW is an ever-changing game, and every new expansion brings with it new abilities. Sometimes old abilities are cut to either make way for the new or just simply get outdated and are no longer needed because a new ability does what it did, but better. And sometimes Blizzard just removes abilities because they hate fun and are a bunch of killjoys. This list will go over 10 of the most missed abilities removed from the game. First up at number 10, we've got Corpse Explosion. The ability was simple: blow up a nearby corpse, and you could do it to an ally corpse as well. I kinda understand why it was removed. I mean, its AoE potential could only really be utilized when mobs were already dying. And I don't know if you've ever AoE down mobs in a dungeon or raid before, but most mob packs where an AoE like this would be useful die within seconds of each other. And you couldn't blow up the same corpse twice, so it wasn't all that useful with multiple death knights. But the ability was still just a lot of fun to play with. That's probably why it was turned into a cosmetic glyph rather than an actual ability in Mists when they brought it back. And while I'm on the topic of Death Knights, Unbreakable Armor was a unique cooldown that a lot of Frost Death Knights miss. Imagine an offensive cooldown that was also a defensive cooldown, and you've got yourself Unbreakable Armor. Reinforces your armor with a thick coat of ice, increasing your armor by 25%, and increasing your strength by 20% for 20 seconds. Even its little flavor text was cool. This was one of the talents Death Knights had when all 3 specs could tank, so they baked a lot of tanking abilities into DPS talents. And this was one of the few abilities in the game that was both a damage and defensive buff. Frost Death Knights were taking less damage in raids by just using their normal rotations. Once Blood became the only tank spec for Death Knights, the ability was removed and replaced with Pillar or Frost, I think. And I can't forget to mention Shadow of Death when talking about cool Death Knight spells removed from the game. Shadow of Death was an unholy talent that would self-res a Death Knight on death for about 40 seconds. And it worked in arenas. Probably one of the most overpowered talents ever put in the game, and removed for a good reason. Now let's go into the next item on the list, Riposte, a combat talent that was only usable after parrying an attack. That would do 150% weapon damage, disarm the target, award a combo point, and only costed 10 energy to use. Not very useful in PvE, but all of this is pretty damn nice in PvP. A 10 energy combo point generator that actually hit decently hard, and had a disarm effect? All of this was really good. Later on, the disarm was replaced with an attack speed slow, which was still pretty good, since it's already a really good ability without the CC effect. The ability was removed in Cataclysm because rogues just don't have all that much parry, so the ability couldn't be used all that often. They did have dodge for days though. If they had just changed the requirement to a dodge rather than a parry, it would have guaranteed seen a lot more play. Number 8 on the list will be a couple of totems. First up, Cleansing Totem. Cleansing Totem was an overpowered dispel bot that would attempt to remove 1 disease and 1 poison effect from party members within 30 yards every 3 seconds for 5 minutes. That's a long ass time to have something passively removing debuffs from you and your party. I can kinda see why it was removed. Of course, this totem only existed in Wrath. Before Wrath, there were 2 separate totems that removed the poison and disease, aptly named Poison Cleansing Totem and Disease Cleansing Totem. Cleansing Totem was just a merger of the 2. Stormlash Totem was a totem that only existed in Mist, and was a cooldown based totem that would add a little bit of lightning damage to all spells and attacks to all allies for 10 seconds. It wasn't a huge amount of damage, but it was a neat little totem to see, and wasn't like game breaking or anything. It was just a cool little totem removed for not being all that useful. And finally, Sentry Totem. If you were to talk about some of the most useless abilities in the game, Sentry Totem might come up in that conversation. All it did was allow you to look through the eyes of the totem, so it was pretty much exclusively a scouting tool that was rarely used. But it was a fun little scouting tool that lots of shamans like to play around with to take screenshots of first kill raid bosses and stuff. Number 7 will be a couple of druid abilities. First up, we've got Symbiosis, a spell that was really weird and confusing and probably a nightmare for Blizzard to balance. What it would do was grant the druid an ability based on which class it used the ability on, and grant the class an ability. For example, a druid could use it on a mage to give it the ability to use Healing Touch, and druids would gain the ability to use mirror images if they were balanced, Frost Nova if Feral, Frost Armor if Guardian, and Ice Block if Resto. Sometimes the ability druids gave other classes were pretty useful, like Shadow Priest got the ability to use Tranquility. but most of the time the ability was kind of meh, like how mages got healing touch. Druids would really only use it on classes that gave them a nice ability. I remember my druid healer in raid would always use it on our shaman for Spirit Walker's Grace to be able to cast while moving. Seemed like a really fun and unique ability, but it only lasted one expansion. Insect Swarm was a neat balanced druid ability. In lore, druids are able to control insects to some degree, and using a swarm of insects to blind an enemy is something they do. So Insect Swarm's first iteration was a balanced druid dot that could lower the target's hit chance and do damage. Later on though, when they removed hit reduction abilities from all player moves, Insect Swarm was just turned into a normal dot, albeit a pretty unusual dot that ticked every 2 seconds instead of the standard every 3 seconds. But a normal dot nonetheless. When Blizzard tried pushing their whole stupid Eclipse mechanic on druids, they just kinda removed Insect Swarm and replaced it with Sunfire, as it fit the theme of balanced druids more than a neutered spell that didn't even work the way it used to anymore. And Thorns. I miss Thorns and other damage on attack abilities. I know they were never all that useful, but they were fun to play around with, especially while soloing old content. Just run around and let the passive damage kill everything that managed to hit you. They did try to make Thorns a somewhat useful short-term buff in Cataclysm by making it do more reflect damage while only lasting 20 seconds rather than being a 10-minute buff. But I guess they didn't like it, so they removed the ability Miss, and with it, the last Thorns ability left in the game. Number 6. Detect Invisibility. This spell allowed warlocks to see mages who used invisibility, and to see the succubi in the Arcatraz where the second and third boss were. And that's pretty much the end of its combat usefulness. It also allowed you to see ghosts out in the world, like the ghosts in Undercity, and was one of the few ways to see them. But it was removed in Cataclysm for not being all that useful. Warlocks also had another similar ability at one point called Paranoia, that the Fellhunter pet could use passively that gave all allies better stealth detection. And since the Fellhunter was one of the most useful pets in PvP, this was actually not half bad for sniffing out rogues and druids. But the ability was removed and replaced with some kind of mana buff, I think. Number 5. Plains Running. Technically an ability in beta WoW, but a removed ability nonetheless. This was supposed to be the Thorns racial mount similar to the Worgen's Running Wild, but for Plains Running, the mount buff would activate after running for 5 seconds straight. It just seems like it would be fun to watch a Tauren keeping up with other people on their horses and wolves and shit, but the ability itself wasn't all that well designed. For starters, it required 5 seconds of running, while a mount could be cast in 3 seconds back then. And if you took any damage while running, you'd lose the speed buff. So not as useful as a normal mount either. Number 4. Khadgars Unlocking. This was another ability that didn't make it past beta, which was supposed to be the mage's way to pick locks like rogues. It makes sense lore-wise to just be able to use magic to unlock something, and to be very similar to the Arcane Trickster, a subclass of rogues in D&D that could use magic to unlock items at range with invisible hands. But the ability was removed for some reason, I don't know. It seems like it'd be a good idea to have 2 classes in the game that could pick locks, but I guess not. Number 3. A couple of priest abilities. Void Shift, Mind Soothe, and Star Shards. I personally missed Void Shift the most as a priest main. This was like the only emergency heal I had as a disc priest, was to swap health with my tank. Sure, I died a few times due to the ability, but I saved way more lives with it than killed me. It was also pretty fun to use back when it worked on pets. You could basically get a full heal with it similar to Lay on Hands by using it on your Shadow Fiend or Void Tendrils. But sadly, it only lasted 1 expansion. But I think they're bringing it back in Legion, which would be super cool. Mind Soothe was an ability I didn't know was removed until I couldn't find it in my spellbook one day while trying to sneak past mobs in a challenge mode. The spell basically allowed you to stealth past mobs and to reduce their aggro radius. But it only worked on humanoids and dragonkin for some reason, so it wasn't all that useful. I still miss it pretty much every time I run challenge modes though. And Star Shards. Star Shards were a Night Elf priest racial that was basically a channeled arcane dot with one of the coolest spell effects in the game. It was removed when they removed the priest-only racials in Wrath, with all the other ones that weren't turned into baseline abilities, like Fear Ward and Devouring Plague. Number 2. Divine Intervention. One of the most missed abilities like ever. The Paladin spell allowed you to kill yourself to protect one other ally from all damage for 3 minutes, or until they ended the spell. Since they couldn't move or use abilities while the spell was on them, it was only useful for saving a healer if you're about to call a raid wipe, so they could just res everyone later. I guess it could have been used to save a very important person's life since they could just click off the buff, but it had such a long cooldown, almost an hour long until Wrath, where it was lowered to the still long 20-minute cooldown, that it wasn't really a reliable save option. Plus, there's the whole thing where the paladin would die if they used it, which was pretty bad. The spell was removed in Cataclysm and was missed by pretty much all paladins. It wasn't very useful, but it was fun to kill yourself to protect a healer on a raid wipe once every hour. The ability might return in Legion as a passive ability that will prevent a death, kinda like a rogue's cheat death. So yay for it coming back as a useful ability. But is it really the same if it doesn't work at all like it used to, and instead just has a vaguely similar design with the same name? Not really. Where's the fun in not killing yourself to save someone? Number 1. Eyes of the Beast. Probably one of the most fun abilities in the game that was removed for like no reason. What it did was basically allowed a hunter to control their pet directly, while their body just stayed back and channeled the spell. Very similar to a priest's mind control. The cool thing about this spell was that you could use all of your pet's abilities while controlling them. One of my favorite things to do was take either a cat or a spirit beast pet to AV, and have my pet sneak into bases and harass people, since those two pets could stealth. It wasn't very effective, but it was a lot of fun. Same with controlling a rhino on Eye of the Storm and using its knockback to send people flying off the middle. I mean, I can kinda get why it was removed. It didn't really have any practical uses outside of positioning pets better if you were using them to pet tank or solo old bosses, but it was fun to play with, and I'm still waiting for the day it returns. I mean, warlocks have Eye of Kilrog, why can't we get Eyes of the Beast back already?